production of immaterial goods. So I don't mean that the production process itself is immaterial. We always work with our bodies and our minds. But I mean that the products are immaterial. So I'm thinking of the products, the production of images, the production of information, the production of knowledges, the production of communication itself, or even the production of affects. The production of affects being not just emotions, but states of the mind and body, let's say. So that think of, at the high end of the economy, an example of this might be a software worker, producing code, or producing images and ad agencies, stuff like that. But it's also at the low end of the economy. I mean, like this affective labor, I think of it as a high component, for instance, in service work in McDonald's, for instance. The slogan, service with a smile. What they have to do in McDonald's is, you don't just serve burgers, you've got to create affects. You have to create a sense of well-being or ease. Healthcare workers do the same thing. You stitch up people, you change bedpans, but that a primary job of a healthcare worker is that. Or all of you, like with flight attendants, for instance. Flight attendants they of course do certain things, but mostly what flight attendants have to do is they have to be nice to assholes. That's the job. And so it's a kind of affective labor is what I'm saying. So our term immaterial production is a way of trying to grasp together the forms of production that are not always new, but perhaps newly important, that are characterized by these various things together. You might call it, the French economists like to call this cognitive work. And that grasps part of it, or you might say service industry, that grasps part of it, but we're trying to sort of grasp the generality of it. So the claim is, here's the difficult part of the claim, because you can understand the term, I think. The difficult part of the claim is this one about hegemony. So the notion is, or the claim is, that for a good 200 years, there's been an hegemony of industrial labor. And what does that mean? Even though industrial labor has been a minority of the working population, it was certainly, in the Industrial Revolution, a very small part of the global population was working industry. If you're talking just numbers, most people then and now work in the fields, if you're trying to think about global numbers. But rather, industrial labor had an hegemony, industrial production, in the sense that it imposed its qualities not only over other forms of production, but over society itself. Mining had to industrialize, agriculture had to industrialize, society itself had to industrialize. And that's what we've been living under for the past 200 years, is that hegemony of industrial production. So that it not only involved its mechanisms, the mechanization of society, etc., it also involved its temporality, for instance, that the rhythms of the working day of industrial labor were imposed over society itself. The nuclear family constructed by industrial production, with the male family wage and female domestic labor, etc. All of these things are imposition of the qualities of industrial production, of its hegemony. The claim is that today we're shifting towards an hegemony of this immaterial production. So again, it's not that it's quantitatively dominant. It's also not that it's spread equally across the world. In fact, divisions of labor and power are defined by it, that it's kept certain times in the dominant parts of the world to the exclusion of others, etc. But rather, this is what the claim is, that progressively its qualities are being imposed over other forms of production and over society itself. So that today, industry is progressively having to informationalize, become image-oriented, become intelligent, become communicative, maybe even become affective. I don't know what that would mean in terms of industry. But think about all the other sectors of production are having to adapt and give new importance to these immaterial, I'd rather call them biopolitical elements, but that seems like too long to explain. And so, what's the consequence of this? I mean, one is, you can see it's a large economic claim, that, again, I don't know if we're right, but it seems right to me. But the importance for the discussion right here is that there are certain capacities that are implied by this biopolitical production, or this immaterial production. And the kinds of capacities like the production of knowledge, the production of affects, these are really social capacities. These are abilities even to create social relationships, create processes of cooperation, create kind of communication. It's very different than the kind of capacities that were involved in the factory. I mean, workers in factories knew a lot, and they had a lot of abilities, but they were different than these. These are the kind of capacities that, in fact, make indistinguishable economic from political activity. You see what I mean? That if you think of politics as the process of constructing society, that's one way of thinking what politics is. You know, the life of the polis could be thought of as the ability to produce society. What these workers are able to do is they're able to, or they're being forced to, produce social relations. They've got, it's enormous power in their hands. You know, like remember the slogans of the pride of workers in the auto factory. And a justified pride was, we know how to make the entire automobile. The managers, the factory owners, they don't know how to make anything. We don't know how to make everything in the automobile. We know how to make the carburetor, the windshield, etc. And that was the great pride of those workers. Well, say you think about this kind of biopolitical production that's really the production of the elements of social life itself. What are the capacities and the pride of those workers? They know how to make social relationships. It's this, I'm abbreviating this a lot, but I'm trying to indicate the way that one could recognize, even if all these things involve new kinds of torture. I mean, there's some horribly torturous ways in which involved in affective labor, for instance. You're like, no longer do I just have to do something work. The most intimate part of me has to be commanded. I have to be, my ability to love, my ability to be nice to people, that's part of my job. It sucks. But nonetheless, there are capacities involved in this, and this is what I want to highlight. Capacities that have implications about what people are able to do, how they're able to sustain society, how they're able to create society. There's several more parts of that I'm going to skip. The next is, so that's in order to have a view of the possibility of a democratic global society, one, like I was saying, one would have to guarantee the capacities generalized across the globe that are able to sustain this. And that's what I was trying to indicate, and I think that's why a lot of the project stands or falls on these economic notions. I was trying to illustrate a possibility of thinking that in economic terms, that in people's own working lives they have these abilities. That's how to categorize that part. Here, I'll take a complete break from this and think about the philosophical approach to it, which will maybe be a lot easier. A lot of this, one way of attacking it at least, is through 17th century English political thought. Because it's the one time that really there was a properly political concept of multitude used in English. For a relatively brief period. You know, in English, I think, and I've tried to experience this with other people, that the most people have heard the term multitude and feel comfortable with it from the King James Bible. But of course, the King James Bible comes from this same period. But really, in the King James Bible, multitude is really used to mean just many. Whereas there was a period during the English Civil War in which multitude had a properly political concept. It didn't just mean many. And this is how it went. In fact, I love this historian who writes that it was on a specific day that the term was starting to be used this way. In fact, I would love to write something saying that modernity started on that day, when it was imagined that the multitude could take power. So he says, in the winter of 1642, in the early period of the English Civil War, the Parliament's fighting against the royal forces. The parliamentary forces are losing. And the radicals get together and try to discuss what are we going to do, because their great fear is that the Parliament will concede. The Parliament will concede and make a truce with the royal forces. And their slogan at that point is, in that case, the power that is rested in the people will be given to the multitude. And what they mean by this, the distinction between the people and the multitude, is the people are the property landowners who elect Parliament, whereas the multitude is everyone regardless of property, so that the servants, etc. These are, and the great imagination of this, I mean, yes, there are two aspects of it. Not only can this great multiplicity of different populations, I mean, there's people with property without, people who are servants, people who are, you know, in households, etc. Not only can this great multiplicity of actors act together and take power, that's what they're arguing, that power will fall back to the multitude. It also imagines, there was a second thing, God damn it, how do I start these sentences? There was a second aspect that was great about what they did in that concept. I can't remember, I'll go on, it'll come back to me. What we mostly get, actually, because I was sort of recounting a difficult history that you mostly get in pamphlets of the revolutionaries, what we mostly get is the attack on the multitude, a negative definition of it. And I'll just give you Hobbes, because he's the clearest about this.